September 3, 1963, 2:47 a.m. Malcolm X walked into Small's paradise alone. No bodyguards. No Nation of Islam brothers. Just him, a briefcase, and a question that had been eating at him for months. At table 7, Bumpy Johnson was waiting. Cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling. A glass of cognac untouched. Eyes that had seen 30 years of Harlem's wars, and somehow never closed permanently. What happened in the next 90 minutes never made it into any history book. The FBI had bugs in that restaurant, but the tape mysteriously disappeared 3 days later. Malcolm never spoke about it publicly. Bumpy took it to his grave. But people were there. Waiters, musicians, old-timers who knew when to watch and when to forget. And what they saw that night was two kings, trying to figure out the same problem from completely different thrones. How do you protect your people when the system is designed to destroy them? To understand why Malcolm X needed Bumpy Johnson's advice, you have to understand where Malcolm was in September 1963. He was at the peak of his power and the beginning of his doubt. Malcolm had spent the last decade building the Nation of Islam into a force that terrified white America. His speeches were fire. His logic was sharp as a blade. He didn't ask for rights, he demanded them. He didn't believe in integration, he believed in separation. And when white liberals talked about peaceful protest, Malcolm talked about self-defense by any means necessary. The media called him the most dangerous man in America. Martin Luther King preached nonviolence. Malcolm preached preparation. If someone puts their hands on you, make sure they never put their hands on anybody else again. That was Malcolm's philosophy, and millions of black Americans, especially young ones tired of turning the other cheek, were listening. But by September 1963, Malcolm was starting to see cracks. Not in his message, in the movement. The Nation of Islam's leadership was getting comfortable. Money was flowing in. Properties were being bought. And Malcolm was hearing rumors, ugly rumors, about Elijah Muhammad, the man he called his spiritual father. Worse, Malcolm was starting to realize something that kept him up at night. Anger is easy. Revolution is hard. He could fill stadiums with people ready to fight. But where was the strategy? Where was the endgame? How do you turn rage into power without getting everyone killed? That's when someone mentioned Bumpy Johnson. You want to know how to survive a war against a system that wants you dead. Talk to the man who's been doing it for 30 years. Malcolm knew of Bumpy. Everyone in Harlem knew Bumpy. The godfather of Harlem. The man who controlled the numbers racket, who'd stood up to the Italian mob, who'd spent time in Alcatraz and walked out like he'd been on vacation. But Malcolm had never respected street criminals. He saw them as part of the problem, poison in the black community, profiting off their own people's desperation. Still, Malcolm was a pragmatist. And Bumpy had something Malcolm needed. Answers. The meeting was arranged through a mutual contact, a man named Illinois Gordon who moved in both worlds. The message to Bumpy was simple. Malcolm X wants to talk. Not politics. Strategy. Bumpy's response: Small's paradise. Wednesday, 2 a.m. Come alone. September 3, 1963, 2:47 a.m. Malcolm walked through the door of Small's paradise. The jazz band had stopped playing an hour ago. Most of the customers were gone. Only the serious people remained, the ones who did business when the sun went down. Bumpy was at his usual spot, table 7 in the back corner, positioned so he could see both exits and the front door. Old habit from 30 years of staying alive. He didn't stand when Malcolm approached, didn't extend his hand, just gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Minister Malcolm, I was wondering when you'd come." Malcolm sat down slowly, placing his briefcase on the floor. He studied Bumpy's face. 58 years old, gray at the temples, scars on his knuckles from fights that had become legends. But his eyes were calm, calculating, the eyes of a man who'd mastered the art of controlled violence. "You were expecting me?" Malcolm asked. Bumpy smiled slightly. "I've been watching you on television, listening to your speeches. You're smart, Malcolm. Too smart not to realize you're fighting a war without a plan. We have a plan. Build economic independence, create our own institutions, defend ourselves when attacked. That's a philosophy, not a plan." Bumpy lit a fresh cigar. Philosophy gets people inspired. Plans keep them alive. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a street criminal. "And you think running numbers and paying off cops is a plan?" "I think I've kept Harlem alive for 30 years, while the Italians tried to take it. I think Dutch Schultz came for me with 12 men, and I'm still here. I think the 5 families put a $50,000 contract on my head, and I'm sitting in this restaurant drinking cognac." Bumpy leaned forward. "So yeah, Malcolm. I think I know a little something about fighting impossible wars." Silence. The waiter brought Malcolm a coffee without being asked. Malcolm didn't touch it. "Why did you agree to meet me?" Malcolm asked finally. "Because you remind me of myself 20 years ago. Angry. Righteous. Ready to burn the whole world down to prove a point." Bumpy tapped ash from his cigar. "And I want to make sure you don't make the same mistakes I did." "What mistakes?" "Thinking your enemies are the only threat. They're not. The real danger comes from the people who smile at you, while sharpening their knives behind your back." Malcolm's expression shifted slightly. Bumpy noticed. "You're already seeing it, aren't you, in your own organization? People getting comfortable. Money changing hands. Loyalty getting negotiable." Malcolm didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. Bumpy continued. "Let me tell you a story. 1952. I was at the top of my game. Controlled the numbers in Harlem. Had the respect of the streets. Even the Italians had backed off after I made my position clear. I thought I was untouchable. What happened? My own bodyguard took a contract to kill me. Man I called brother. Man I'd saved from getting murdered by Dutch Schultz's crew. $50,000 was all it took to turn him." Malcolm leaned forward despite himself. "What did you do?" "I knew about it 3 weeks before he tried." Bumpy smiled at the memory. Had people watching him. Knew exactly when he was going to make his move. So I swapped his gun with a dummy. Let him walk into a crowded restaurant. Let him pull the trigger. Let everyone see what he really was. You humiliated him. I taught him. And I taught everyone else in that room. You can't kill a man who's always 3 steps ahead. You can't buy loyalty that's built on respect instead of fear. Malcolm absorbed this. You let him live. I let him leave. With a message for the people who paid him. That attacking me would cost more than they could afford. And it worked. I'm still here. Bumpy studied Malcolm's face. But here's what you need to understand, Malcolm. I won that battle because I knew who I was fighting and what I was fighting for. I wasn't trying to change the system. I was trying to survive inside it long enough to protect my people. That's the difference between us, Malcolm said quietly. I'm not trying to survive the system. I'm trying to destroy it. I know. That's why you're in more danger than I ever was. The words hung in the air. Bumpy poured himself another cognac. He didn't offer one to Malcolm. He knew Malcolm didn't drink. You ever read Sun Tzu? Bumpy asked. Malcolm blinked at the unexpected question. The Art of War, yes. Then you know what he said. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Bumpy leaned back. You know the enemy, Malcolm. White supremacy, systemic oppression, institutional racism. You understand it better than anyone I've ever heard speak. But I don't think you know yourself yet. I don't think you've figured out what you're really fighting for. Malcolm's eyes flashed with anger. I'm fighting for my people, for justice, for the right to exist with dignity. Those are beautiful words. But what do they mean in practice, when the FBI is watching every move you make? When your own organization is fracturing? When the system you want to destroy has infinite resources, and you have what? Passionate speeches, and a few thousand followers. We have truth on our side. The Rosenbergs had truth on their side. They're dead. Bumpy's voice was flat, factual. Malcolm, I respect what you're trying to do. But truth doesn't stop bullets. Righteousness doesn't prevent betrayal. And anger, no matter how justified, is not a strategy. So what is? Malcolm's voice was sharp now. What's your strategy? Make deals with the enemy, profit off the suffering of your own people, stay quiet while they burn crosses and lynch children. No. Bumpy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried more weight than any shout. My strategy is to stay alive long enough to make sure there's still a Harlem for the next generation to inherit, to build structures that can't be easily torn down, to create power that doesn't depend on one man's charisma or one leader's life. He pointed his cigar at Malcolm. You're building a movement around yourself. What happens when you're gone? The question hit harder than Malcolm expected. I'm building ideas, Malcolm said. Ideas don't die. Ideas without institutions become memories. Memories become myths. And myths don't pay rent or keep cops from beating your kids in the street. Malcolm was quiet for a long moment. Then, you think I'm doing it wrong. I think you're doing something incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous. And you haven't thought about what happens after the revolution. If you even survive to see it, maybe I won't survive. Maybe that's not the point. Martyrdom is easy, Malcolm. Leadership is hard. Another long silence. The restaurant was almost empty now. Just them, the waiter, and a piano player who'd started playing something slow and mournful. Malcolm finally spoke. Why are you telling me this? You could just sit back and watch me make mistakes. Because I'm tired of watching young men with potential get themselves killed over pride and principle. Bumpy's voice had an edge of wariness. "I've buried too many. And because despite our differences, you and I want the same thing." "What's that?" "For Harlem to still exist tomorrow. For black people to have something that's theirs and can't be taken away." Malcolm considered this. "You do it through crime. I do it through consciousness. And neither of us will succeed alone." Bumpy stood up slowly, his body showing the aches of decades of violence. "You need infrastructure. I need purpose beyond profit. Maybe we're not as different as you think." He extended his hand. Malcolm looked at it for a long moment. Everything he'd preached said not to shake the hand of a criminal, someone who represented the exploitation of black people. But everything he'd learned tonight said this man understood survival in ways Malcolm was only beginning to grasp. Malcolm shook his hand. "I'm not asking you to compromise your principles," Bumpy said. "I'm asking you to protect yourself while you fight for them. Watch your back. Trust very few people. And remember that the most dangerous enemy is the one who prays beside you." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "You know something. I know that powerful men don't like being challenged. I know that organizations become corrupt when money gets involved. And I know that Elijah Muhammad is neither as divine nor as faithful as he pretends to be." Malcolm's face went rigid. "Be careful what you say. I'm always careful. That's why I'm alive." Bumpy picked up his fedora from the table. "But you should ask yourself why the Nation of Islam is buying mansions while Harlem kids go hungry. You should ask where the money really goes. And you should ask why anyone who questions Elijah seems to have unfortunate accidents. You're trying to divide us. I'm trying to wake you up before it's too late." Bumpy placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "Your enemies aren't just white men in Washington, Malcolm. Some of them are sitting next to you in the mosque." With that, Bumpy Johnson walked out of Small's paradise. Malcolm sat alone at table 7 for another hour, coffee gone cold, mind racing. Everything Bumpy said contradicted what Malcolm had built his life on. But everything Bumpy said also rang with the authority of a man who'd survived impossible odds. 3 months later, Malcolm would be suspended from the Nation of Islam for his comments about JFK's assassination. 6 months later, he'd leave the organization entirely. 1 year later, Malcolm would travel to Mecca and return with a transformed worldview. One that acknowledged the possibility of alliance across racial lines. One that prioritized strategic thinking over raw anger. And on February 21, 1965, Malcolm X would be assassinated in the Audubon Ballroom by men connected to the Nation of Islam. Bumpy Johnson would attend the funeral. He would stand in the back, hat in hand, paying respects to a man who'd challenged him and been challenged in return. And people who knew would say that Bumpy cried that day. Not openly, but tears nonetheless, because he'd warned Malcolm. He'd told him the danger was inside, not outside. He'd given him the same advice that had kept Bumpy alive for 30 years. Watch your back. Trust no one completely, and survive long enough to see your work finished. Malcolm had heard the advice. But some men are built to be martyrs, not survivors. And maybe that's exactly what the movement needed. Years later, a reporter would ask Bumpy about Malcolm X. Did you respect him? Bumpy's answer was simple: I respected him more than any man I ever met. Because he knew he was going to die, and he spoke truth anyway. That takes something I don't have. What's that? Faith that dying for something is worth more than living for it. September 3rd, 1963. 2:47 a.m. Two kings met in Harlem. One fought to survive. One fought to transform. Neither won completely. But both left something behind that couldn't be erased. Bumpy Johnson proved you could protect your people through strategy and strength. Malcolm X proved you could inspire your people through truth and sacrifice. And maybe, just maybe, we need both. The warrior who survives and the warrior who transcends. That's the real lesson of the night two kings met in Harlem.